Imagine waking up in a place where the darkness feels alive, as if it's pressing in on you from all sides. The air is thick and damp, carrying the stench of mold and decay. This was my reality. My body ached in ways I hadn't thought possible. Remnants of the torture I'd endured at the hands of the Inquisition. The last thing I remembered before I passed out was the courtroom. I was hanging there, suspended by my thumbs, feeling every pull and strain on my joints. When they finally cut me down, I collapsed onto a cold stone bench, too weak to resist or even stand. Their sentence, death, was the last word I heard clearly. After that, their voices faded to a low, monotonous hum, like the grinding of a distant machine. And then, silence. It was the kind of silence that wraps around you like a shroud, so heavy it muffles your thoughts. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what was happening. I could still see, but my vision was distorted, like looking at a warped reflection in a broken mirror. The faces of my judges swam before me, pale and ghostly, their lips twisted into cruel smiles as they condemned me. Death, they said, with all the emotion of someone asking for a loaf of bread. I remember their lips, thin, bloodless, cruel, shaping my name, then forming the word that sealed my fate. I wanted to scream, to curse them, but my voice was gone. All I could do was watch as they disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone with the weight of their sentence. The room itself felt alive, draped in heavy black curtains that barely moved, though I swore I felt a breeze. For a fleeting moment, a strange thought entered my mind, a thought so gentle that it seemed out of place in such a bleak setting. It was the idea of rest, the sweet relief of the grave, but before I could hold on to that thought, it was ripped away. Darkness rushed in, swallowing everything. My senses disappeared one by one, until all that was left was silence. And then, nothing. I had passed out, but even in that abyss, I was not free. My mind grasped at bits of consciousness, struggling to piece together what was happening. I remember a feeling of being lifted, carried downward, deeper and deeper, as if I were being lowered into the depths of hell. Then came the smell. It was the first thing to jolt me back to reality. Damp, cold, and reeking of decay, it seeped into my lungs and pulled me back into my body. My heart pounded, each beat a deafening drumbeat in the silence. Slowly, painfully, my mind crept toward a single, horrifying realization. I was alive, but where was I? What did they do to me? That was the question burning in my mind as I stood there, terrified out of my mind. For what felt like hours, I lay still, trapped in the suffocating darkness, afraid of what I might see if I opened my eyes. My hand twitched against the cold, damp floor, trying to make sense of the space around me. Every instinct screamed that I was somewhere destined to break not just my body, but my mind. Finally, the terror of the unknown became unbearable. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, and my chest felt like it might explode. Heart pounding, I forced my eyes open. Nothing. The darkness was absolute. No shadows, no glimmers of light. Just a void so intense it felt like the air itself was choking me. For a moment I was convinced I'd gone blind. I waved my hand in front of my face, but saw nothing. Panic set in cold and sharp as I began to hyperventilate. Was this death? Was I already in some cruel and eternal punishment? I tried to gather my thoughts, to think rationally, but each idea brought more terror. My hands moved instinctively, searching the ground for answers. Damp stone greeted my fingers, smooth, cold, and unyielding. The smell of decay was stronger here, as if the earth itself were rotting. I reached up, but there was nothing above me. My hands clawed at the void, desperate to touch something. Slowly, I sat up, my body shaking with the effort. I didn't dare stand up yet. What if I wasn't alone? What if there was something waiting just beyond my reach? But there was only silence. Then a horrifying thought came to me. What if there was nothing? No walls, no ceiling, no end. A pit. endless and empty, with me trapped in its heart. The weight of that thought was unbearable. I had to move, to do something. My hands reached out again, feeling the ground around me. It was slippery, uneven, as if the stones themselves were sweating. Slowly, cautiously, I crept forward, one shaking hand in front of the other, and then nothing. My hand reached out and found only air. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Carefully, I leaned forward, extending my arm as far as I could. The edge of the ground ended abruptly. I picked up a loose rock and tossed it aside. For a moment, there was silence. Then faintly, the sound of stone hitting something far below, followed by a splash that echoed in the abyss. A well. My stomach churned as I scrambled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. They'd put me here to die. That much was clear. The pit wasn't just a trap, it was a message, a reminder that even in this darkness, the Inquisition still had power over me. I sat there for what seemed like an eternity, staring into the void where the well waited. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on me like a physical force. Every breath felt like a struggle, but I refused to give up. I wasn't ready to die. Not yet. The question burned in my mind. What other horrors do they have in store? The questions in my mind were incessant, but no answers came. The smell of damp and decay was growing stronger and stronger, almost suffocating. I decided to explore again, with the same caution, feeling my way along the ground like a blind man. The feeling of the approaching abyss wouldn't let me forget. One false step would be my end. Still, something inside me wanted to resist. I really understood where I was. I needed to fight. Slowly, I began to crawl along the walls, still unable to determine the size or shape of my prison. It was as if each step was a test of courage, and the silence was a merciless companion, mocking my anxiety. Then a terrifying thought occurred to me. The pit was only part of the trap. I knew the Inquisition's confidence. They were masters in the art of psychological and physical torture. There was no way my surviving the first obstacle was a mistake. They planned something bigger, something that would challenge what little sanity I had left. And it was at that moment, as he tried to gather the strength to resist the outcome, that he noticed a change. Something was different. Something. Faint, but distinct. It was a snap, as if a distant door had been opened and closed quickly. Soon after, a faint ray of light invaded the darkness for a brief instant before disappearing again. It was not natural light. It had a strange, almost sulfurous glow, as if it came from something unnatural. That's when I understood that my fight for survival was just beginning. After that fragile ray of light, darkness enveloped me again, more oppressive than ever. The moment of collapse was brief, and my mind quickly began to imagine the cruelties that could come. I knew that the Inquisition was not merciful. They didn't just kill, they enjoyed playing on desperation, twisting people's minds until nothing was left but pure terror. I knew I had to find out more about my prison. I stood up, still feeling the walls, trying to map out the space. Step by step, I felt the dampness on the floor, slipping here and there. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I completed the circuit. Counting the steps, I calculated that the space was circular, with about 100 paces of things. But the shape doesn't make sense. As I continued to explore, I noticed angles, as if what appeared to be a circle was actually an irregular shape. This detail, though small, makes it clear that the environment was designed to confuse and intensify my terror. As I crawled on the ground, my hand touched something unexpected. Food. A loaf of stale bread and a pitcher of water. At first I thought it was a hallucination, but as I touched it again, I realized it was real. Hunger and thirst took hold of me, and I devoured the food without hesitation. It was only later that I realized that feeding me was part of their game. They hadn't planned for me to die quickly. I walked back to the center of the cell, once again determined to find out what I was betting on. Suddenly, As I took a false step, my foot slipped and my body fell forward. My face did not meet the floor as expected, but something much worse: emptiness. I had stumbled over the edge of the well. Trembling, I felt along the edges and smelled the putrid stench that emanated from the abyss. My fingers touched a loose stone, and I let it fall. For long seconds, the sound of its collisions echoed until finally I heard the distant thud of an impact on the water. My heart raced. The well was deep, and the silence that followed seemed to mock me. I understood then that this was a trap. It was not just a place of confinement, it was a deadly puzzle. Every step could lead to my death, but that was not what the Inquisitors wanted. They wanted me to know the good, to fear every move, to make the idea of death more cruel than death itself. I leaned back against the wall, trying to think, trying to control the terror that was consuming me, but the silence was unbearable. And it was at that moment that I noticed another change. Light returned to illuminate the space, revealing more than I ever wanted to see. The walls were covered in grotesque symbols and demonic figures that seemed to stare right at me. But that wasn't the worst of it. On the ceiling, hanging about 50 feet above, was a huge pendulum. At first it seemed motionless, but soon I realized it was swaying, slowly, almost imperceptibly. As I watched it, a chill ran down my spine. The movement was mesmerizing, but something was wrong. The pendulum was no ordinary blade. It was sharp, curved like a crescent, with a gleaming edge that glowed menacingly. Before I could react, I noticed something else. My body was trapped, tied to a low path with thick straps that tightened around my arms, legs, and chest. Only my head and left arm were free. My mind panicked. The pendulum, suspended by a solid chain, was swinging toward me. There was no doubt about its purpose. The blade would descend, slow, inexorable, but deadly. The next few hours were torment beyond imagination. The blade descended inch by inch, each swing closer to my chest. I could hear the sound of the steel cutting through the air, feel the faint wind it generated with each pass. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst through my ribs. I prayed, I begged, I screamed, but the blade would not stop. Desperate, I began to think of any way to escape. Around me, I noticed movement. Rats. They emerged from the shadows, attracted by the smell of food left on the plate by the side of the road. What started as disgust quickly turned into an idea. With the little fatty meat I had left, I began to rub the straps that bound me. The rats, voracious and merciless, approached. At first they hesitated, but soon attacked the bonds. While they chewed, I maintained my propriety, ignoring the paws that crawled over my body and the panic that threatened to take over. The pendulum was dangerously close now. Its blade was already scraping against the serge of my clothing, cutting through each layer with deadly precision. But then I felt the straps loosen. With a final effort, I freed myself. I rolled out of the way just as the blade sliced through the space where my body had been seconds before. But the nightmare was not over yet. Before I could celebrate my escape, the walls began to move. Slowly, the iron plates began to slide, pushing me toward the center of the room. Heat radiated from the walls, growing more intense, and I realized they were forcing me toward the pit. Sweat rolled down my face as I tried to resist. But with every passing second, I was getting closer to the edge of the abyss. I stared into the void in front of me and thought that if I fell, it would be the end. Suddenly, I heard something different. Screams, footsteps, and the sound of a door being kicked in. The entire room shook. Before I could comprehend it, the walls stopped, and light from outside flooded the space. Strong arms pulled me away from the pit. My body sagged, exhausted. I was a French soldier. General Lassalle and his troops had taken over Toledo. The Inquisition had fallen. My torment was over. As the French soldiers' arms pulled me up, I felt my body collapse, surrendered to exhaustion. My mind was still trapped in that place, in the horrors that had nearly consumed me. The pit was still there. its infinite darkness like an endless abyss. The smell of hot iron still filled the air, and the walls that moments before had pressed me in were now evidently falling away, defeated by the arrival of my rescuers. But something inside me didn't believe in freedom. My heart was still beating at the frantic pace of despair. My vision was blurry, the figures around me distorted shadows. The words the soldiers were saying sounded distant, muffled, as if I were still trapped in the oppressive silence of the cell. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, scratchy from the screams that had never been heard. I tried to stand, but my legs gave way, unable to support the weight of everything I had faced. Everything around me was a blur of sounds and lights, a stark contrast to the darkness and silence that had been my world for so long. That was when I saw it, the pendulum, that shallow blade that had nearly torn me in half, hung motionless from the ceiling. The light that now illuminated the space revealed its true form, a sharp, cold crescent made to cut with cruel precision. My chest ached just looking at it, as if my flesh still felt the deadly touch that had nearly occurred. The pit, that black hole in the center of the room, seemed more ominous than ever. Now, with the light revealing its jagged edge and the depth that stretched beyond comprehension, I realized that it was not just a physical abyss. It was the symbol of everything the Inquisition stood for, an infinite void designed to extract any trace of humanity. The room seemed to pulse with the memory of my suffering. Every wall, every stone, every shadow was a reminder of the terror that had nearly destroyed me. I knew I would never escape this place completely. Even when I was free, it would live inside me, like a scar that would never heal. The soldiers pulled me to my feet, speaking in tons of words that were supposed to be soothing, but only deepened my confusion. "You're safe now," one of them said. But the words sounded hollow. How could I feel safe after all this? How could I trust the light after I'd been consumed by darkness? When we finally left that place, the cool night air hit my face. The moon shone in the sky, but to me its light seemed distant, almost irrelevant. I was alive, but a part of me had been left behind in that well, under the pendulum, in the suffocating darkness of the Inquisition. As the soldiers busied themselves with destroying the structure, explosions could be heard and the sound of walls collapsing. That place was being wiped from the face of the earth, but I knew it would never be erased from my memory. Standing, shaking, I looked back one last time. The entrance to that now ruined prison seemed like a portal to another world, a world of pain, despair, and death. A soldier placed his hand on my shoulder, and for the first time, I felt the weight of freedom. "Let's go," he said, and this time, his words rang true. With hesitant steps, I walked away from that place, each movement a reminder that I had survived. But victory didn't feel sweet. I knew the real battle would be carrying that trauma for the rest of my life. The Inquisition had fallen, but the terror it represented, that I would carry with me forever. As I walked away from that hell, the world around me seemed unreal. The starry sky, the cool night air, the distant sound of soldiers celebrating the fall of the Inquisition, all of it was such a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness that still inhabited my mind. Surviving should have been a collapse, a miracle, but instead, I felt empty. It was as if the cell, the pit, the pendulum, and the suffocating walls had taken root inside me, impossible to escape. Even free, I knew I would never be who I was before. The Inquisition was more than a system of torture. It was a symbol of all that is cruel in humanity. It was not just the blades, the fires, or the shackles that would haunt me, but the human capacity to transform suffering into spectacle, from circumstance to horror, in the name of power. I looked at my hands, still shaking, and wondered, what did it mean to be alive after staring death in the face? It wasn't just the body they wanted to destroy, but the mind, the soul, the very essence of what made me human. And perhaps that was the greatest triumph I could claim, because even in the midst of despair, when every swing of the pendulum seemed to rip a shred of sanity from me, I fought. Not with strength or heroic courage, but with the sheer will to keep breathing. And sometimes that was all you had, a stubborn resistance to oblivion. As the soldiers helped me onto a cart, I could hear the echo of the walls crumbling in the distance. This place was being erased, stone by stone, as if the world wanted to forget its existence, but I knew I would never forget. The image of the pit, gaping like the mouth of hell itself, still burned in my mind. The pendulum blade gleaming in the firelight was a constant reminder of how death had been mere seconds away from me. But what haunted me most was the silence, that absolute oppressive silence that makes darkness seem alive. As the wagon rolled along the winding roads, I felt a tear roll down my face. It wasn't from sadness or a broken heart, but from something deeper. It was a farewell, not just from Toledo, but from a part of me I would never get back. The Inquisition had fallen, and with it an age of horror that consumed countless lives. But the scars it left on me and so many others would live on, a grim reminder that the real danger lies not in the tools of torture, but in the minds that devise them. I survived, but I would never be the same again. And as the night stretched around me, I realized that the real fight would not be against the blade or the well, but against the weight of memory.